Hello, everyone. I'm David Galata, and welcome to David Galata Book Dreamer. And today I'm going to talk about a topic that I call Can Fantasy Be Important? Now, first I have to really define what I mean by fantasy. And by that I mean fantasy as in fantasy fiction, as in writing fantasy fiction. Uh, I've really given up a lot on fantasy in film, mainly because fantasy right now is being used for purposes that have really very little to do with fantasy and everything to do with politics. Um, and I just don't care for that. I just don't care for that. So I'm talking about the literary world. That's what I'm talking about. It's the literary world. Can fantasy be important? And if so, how? Fantasy is all the stuff that's not real, things that aren't explained. Like in science fiction, there are explanations. There's, research that's done. Some of the things that are in science fiction, well, most of the things really should be based on reality in some way, shape, or form, and should be based on speculations that have their foundation in current scientific thinking. So that's science fiction. So science fiction definitely has a major root into reality, or what we think of as reality. Whereas fantasy is very much unfettered. It's an unfettered imagination. And that does not have to be based on reality. So can that really be important for us? Is that really something that we can look at and go, yeah, that really changed my life, or yeah, that was so important to me because, it had a real impact on me. Can the unreal have an impact on us? Personally, I think yes. I think it can have an impact on us all. Fantasy is a metaphor, usually a metaphor for things that we struggle with. You know, good versus evil, um, you know, is one of the old cliches of fantasy, Lord of the Rings, anyone. And, you know, uh, we can look deeper. Lord of the Rings in particular has lots of layers of meaning. And that's because I think Tolkien very much used fantasy as a metaphor to ask questions, to explore ideas that can't really be, you know, brought to life in the real world, but has something to do with how we think about the world. When we use fantasy as a metaphor, for example, in my book Clockmaker, the main character, Clockmaker, which is the point of view of the whole book, is lost. He is absolutely lost. And at some point or another, don't we all feel that way? You know, don't we sometimes look at our life and go, I feel a little lost, you know? And how Clockmaker comes to terms with feeling lost is very important. I'm using him as a metaphor for a psychological issue of feeling lost, feeling out of the world. And when he does begin to come to terms with it, he has to deal with other things that have to do with not being who you were a week ago. And I know there's lots of people out there who can relate to that. I look back 10 years, I am not the same person. I look back 20 years, I wouldn't recognize me. And this is an idea that has precious little to do with science, but can be explored very openly in fantasy. And that's where I think fantasy really, really triumphs. It is the myth. It is the legend. It is the metaphor that helps to guide us with our own internal issues. We're not going to sit there and grab a flaming sword and a shield that laughs and, go after our enemies. Not going to happen, you know. But we can look at what happens in fantasy as metaphors for things that we can find useful, that we can interpret for our personal needs. This is why I really don't like a lot of the heavy-handed politics in modern film fantasies. I don't like it because that is someone else's ideas of how you should feel about this rather than you coming to your own decision of how you should feel about certain things. I'm very much more into open-ended interpretations than there is only one way to interpret this, and I don't care for that. Not that there's really a lot of fantasy coming out in Hollywood these days, is there? A lot of superhero stuff, which I actually consider more science fiction than anything else. And it kind of leans a little into the fantasy because they're getting way beyond speculative anything. They're getting into loopy land. But I know that as a fantasy writer for myself, I tend to take fantasy as a wonderful playground in which to explore ideas that I don't have solutions for. Um, I like to look at them as ways of presenting questions that most people are afraid to ask. I find fantasy a way of exploring ideas that most people might feel very hesitant to explore. But when placed into a very interesting and adventurous, um, playground, oh, you can just have fun with it and enjoy, but the meat is still there. The meat of the matter is still there. The metaphor is still at work. And it's beyond a what if. It's more along the lines of, you know, can someone find redemption and yet remain the scoundrel they are? You know, um, that's part of Favored Son, which is one of my books. uh, Clockmaker. Uh, who are you when you have lost your way? Who are you, and what can you become when you have let go of your own past because you had to? You know, these are questions that science doesn't have an answer for. Science is more into the how, what, when, where, not why. Uh, sometimes who. But there are certain questions science really isn't geared for answering. And if you want to really explore something, you want to put it into a certain set of situations. And this is why sometimes, you've heard, a person writing themselves into a corner. An author can do that very easily, writing yourself into a corner. You're like, I don't know, I don't know how to resolve this. That's good news. That means you've actually hit a topic that you yourself are struggling with. And so when you finally figure out the answer to that logic or illogic knot that you've created, you have advanced as a person. So will your readers. You know, when you paint yourself into a corner, then you are in a really great zone for an opportunity to break through the wall. And now you're not in a corner anymore. You know, can you make an exit door behind you? Wow. Okay, if I make an exit door behind me, then I'm not stuck in a corner. I'm next to the door. You know, hope you're getting that metaphor there. I'm sure you do. I hope I'm getting the metaphor. So fantasy actually can have a real effect. It can have a real impact on a person's life, especially if it's grounded in the emotional sphere of the author. You know, we human beings struggle with a lot of common things. Not everyone likes to admit that, but it's true. There's a lot of common denominators when it comes to humanity's struggle with itself. And fantasy can be a very useful way of pointing out the fantasies, the foibles, the pitfalls, and the triumphs that we can achieve. And this, of course, you know, applies to thoughtful fantasy. If it's just a bunch of tropes put together with some cool names and pretty people, well, okay, that might work, but it's been done 1,000 times, and we've heard the same metaphor the same way, maybe a little too often. But if you try to think a little outside the box, I mean, you don't have to throw it all out. I mean, some things are classic. Some ideas are classic ideas because they work. Because they work. So don't worry about that so much, but try to put in some unique points of view. Try to put in a new twist to an old idea. And that's what keeps fantasy going, is that new twist, that new turn, that new face, that facet of the diamond you haven't looked at. Ooh, there's a flaw there. Or, oh, this one is perfectly clear. You don't know. And exploring that with the mind is very, very important. I think fantasy is very emotionally satisfying when done right. And I think it can really lead to wonderful insights on how we not only experience life, but how we can overcome our own trials to make life better for ourselves. Uh, I don't want to really talk about fantasy as, a slogan, because that's far too often. That's far too often. Um, and I am talking about fantasy that um, is trying to become myth and legend. You know, uh, there's got to be that grain of truth, and that grain can sometimes be huge. You know, um, it has to show the struggle. It has to show the development of the characters as they're dealing with all the things around them. I mean, you could have a whole book about a family of dragons and still touch the human heart because those dragons represent something. And what they're going through represents something. And sometimes it's a familiar thing. So you can touch on topics that might be a little sensitive if you came right out into their face and just said, oh, blah, there it is. That's not subtle. But let's make parable. Let's present a play. Let's be poetic and bring these uncomfortable ideas about ourselves forward so that we can explore them together and rise above them. So in that way, I think fantasy is very important. Now, personally, I do prefer science fiction over fantasy. It's just the way I am. I love the sciences. It's, pretty much the bottom line. But I do write fantasy, kind of, sort of, and I do enjoy really well-written fantasy, and I'm picky. Uh, so that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give me a nice little thumbs up and please subscribe. And thank you for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video of mine. All right, everyone. See you all next week and happy reading, everybody.